Hi everybody, this is Sean Doobie, Technical Director for Windows IT Pro. With me today is John Saville. John is a Senior Technical Contributor for Windows IT Pro. He's a 11-time MVP for Microsoft. He's an MCSE for Private Cloud and also an MCITP as well. He has a lot of experience in talking to a lot of people about cloud computing and the ins and outs. Welcome, John.
Nope, glad to be back.
I thought that our topic, a good topic today to talk about, would be how you go about building, what would be the right way to go about building a private cloud. I guess that you would call it a Windows-oriented or a Microsoft-oriented private cloud. There are a lot of parts to it, and it's hard to, I can see how it would be difficult to figure out how to get started on it or how to build it the right way. You don't want to get halfway through it and realize that you've made some heinous design decision, you know?
Yep. Yeah, so, I mean, if you think about what the private cloud is, I mean, the first thing is you're building on top of a virtualization infrastructure. So, from the Microsoft perspective, it would be a Hyper-V. So, you would need to have a good virtualization architecture in place. So, you're using Hyper-V, you've got clustered systems together, so you're pooling your resources. Because the key point is the private cloud is enabling these capabilities. It's enabling pooling your resources together. It's enabling great elasticity as services can grow and shrink depending on demand. But it's providing abstraction. It's providing abstraction, for example, of the storage and the network from the user actually requesting a virtual machine or service. So I can just say, hey, I want a VM on a silver tier of storage in Florida connected to the dev network. I don't have to go and say this IP address, this VLAN, that SAN. And so we have our hypervisors, we have our compute, but we also then need storage. So really you need some kind of centralized storage. So typically that's a SAN, it could be a network appliance, but I need some kind of centralized storage where I can create all of my virtual machines so that virtual machines aren't tied to a single host. I really want to try and avoid the use of local storage. It really just causes me challenges. So I want some kind of centralized storage. And of course, from a networking perspective, I need a very good understanding of what my network infrastructure looks like. Because to provide that abstraction of the network through my private cloud, I have to have a good idea that, well, the development network in this location is this VLAN and these IP subnets, and I can use these addresses. So you need a good knowledge of your existing infrastructure. So we have our compute, our storage, and our network fabric. And really the big difference between virtualization and private cloud is the management infrastructure. So from a Microsoft perspective, it's System Center 2012. I mean, that really is the Microsoft private cloud solution. And different components give you different capabilities. So the most fundamental thing if you were going to get started would be System Center Virtual Machine Manager. So Virtual Machine Manager is that component that is going to allow you to connect to all your hypervisors. It's going to allow you to connect to the storage via SMIS and then classify the different LUNs and the different SANs you have into a gold tier, a silver tier, a bronze tier, for example. It's going to manage all that connectivity. It's going to be able to let you define all your networks. So I'm going to define my dev network, my production network, and then what those networks actually mean in my different locations. So then I can actually ask VMM, hey, create me a VM, create it in Florida, just been Disney World, create me a VM in Florida. I want it on the silver tier of storage connected to my production network. And it has that knowledge. It's connected to other SANs in the different locations. It knows based on your classifications which LUNs or which tier of storage. You've defined which IP address ranges represent the different networks and the connectivity based on the location. So now it's given me that abstraction. It's given me that key piece of the private cloud. It's also pulling all my resources together because now it's actually giving me that capability to connect to all my different hypervisors. And we're saying a Microsoft-centric solution, so we say Hyper-V, but that could also be ESX. It could be Zen Server, and obviously Hyper-V as well, all mixed together. So that's one of those key capabilities. So I think if you're getting started, VMM would be that first major block.
So step one is to make sure that you've got your virtualization infrastructure in place correctly with, I might add, Lifecycle incorporated into it.
Exactly. Yeah, and then once you've got the VMM in place, the next part is probably, well, how do I want to interact with this? If I do want to enable end user self-service, which is always a bit scary, but VMM lets you create those clouds. It lets you create a cloud which is a selection of all the resources available, so I can create a business unit cloud, a test cloud, that's allowed to use these hosts, these tiers of storage, is allowed to maybe connect to my backup network or my dev network, but not my production network. Then I can assign quotas to groups of users who can use that cloud. And then App Controller is a Silverlight-based web interface that end users could go and use to request VMs, to manage the VMs, to create snapshots.
And App Controller is completely new with Windows Server 2012. It's not, doesn't have any of the legacy. It's not one of the legacy components, so people may not be as familiar with it.
Correct. So it's a new component in System Center 2012 that in previous versions of Virtual Machine Manager, it had a web-based portal, which was very limited in scope. You actually see it's disappeared. With SP1 of System Center 2012, they dumped the VMM web portal altogether. Basically, now the direction is App Controller. So you can think you can have virtualization, so let's say Hyper-V, you have Virtual Machine Manager managing those resources, the storage, the network, the compute, and an App Controller provides you a nice web interface to go and request VMs, to manage them, take snapshots, etc. So you could say that would be like an initial starting private cloud, just those components.
Okay.
But then you start talking about, well, I want to go and request a new cloud. I want to go and request a change to my quota. I want workflow management. I want people to approve this request. So once we get into that sort of requirement, well, that's when Service Manager comes in. So Service Manager is another component of System Center 2012, and that adds workflow capabilities. It allows me to define relationships and authorization requirements. So now a user can go to a single sort of service catalog where they can request, I want a VM. I want to request a new cloud. I want to request a quota change. I want to request an app, which is going to be deployed with Config Manager. I want to raise an incident. I want to request a new chair. This is the single sort of service catalog for the IT organization. And then that talks to Virtual Machine Manager via Orchestrator. So this is where you get all these different components. The Service Manager gives you sort of this centralized service catalog. It calls runbooks in Orchestrator, which then goes and performs actions via VMM. So they all integrate very, very tightly. So again, that starts to give you a more powerful private cloud solution. And Microsoft actually had a cloud services process pack that you download this, you install it, and it has add-ons for Orchestrator to give you the runbooks needed to go and talk to Virtual Machine Manager. It adds things like chargeback and showback to Service Manager. So now I can actually work out a dollar cost. I'm using this much CPU, this much memory. It gives you those next level of private cloud capabilities. And of course, you're doing all this stuff, you want to make sure it's monitored. So you have Operations Manager, another component of System Center, to make sure you're doing that management. You got Config Manager, patching it, maybe desired configuration management. DPM might be backing it up and protecting it. So really every single component of the System Center can start to come into play, but definitely initially you're talking virtualization and VMM App Controller.
So, right, so what you're saying is you could take a baby step with just VMM and with App Controller, and you basically have an infrastructure as a service private cloud?
Yes, I mean, it gives you that ability to create the quotas, to offer virtual machines, to offer entire multi-tiered services, and it's still abstracting the compute, the storage, and the network. So it's giving you those fundamental private cloud capabilities. It's only when you want those next level of like showback and chargeback capabilities and being able to request changes to quota or authorization, that's when you start building into Service Manager and Orchestrator.
Right. All right, John. Thank you very much. That's a great overview. I think it's very interesting to hear about how System Center, the different System Center components interact with each other, and I hate to use the word synergy, but the synergy that they provide with one another. I'm sure I'll be talking to you in the future on some other topics, but thank you for your time.
I appreciate you having me.